I didn't care who he was. When that massive car blocked my way to the hospital, all I saw was an obstacle keeping me from my sister. I screamed at him, pounded on his window, completely unaware that I was challenging Leo Moretti, the man who owned this city. I thought he would kill me. Instead, he showed up at my door with answers I couldn't find, and a protection I didn't ask for. They called me a mechanic, a nobody, a weakness. But Leo didn't see a grease-stained girl. He saw the fire that matched his own. When he stood before the wolves and claimed me as his equal, handing me the iron symbol of his family, I realized I wasn't just fixing his cars anymore. I was fixing his heart. And together we weren't just surviving the world, we were ruling it. That day the sun was bright, blinding, really reflecting off the black paint of that massive, ridiculous SUV, and all I could hear was the ragged, desperate sound of Evelyn trying to pull air into her lungs next to me. Her heart-conditioned tetralogy of something complicated, it was always a ticking clock, a constant low-level anxiety that lived right beneath my sternum. But that morning, the clock was running way too fast, faster than I'd ever heard it. Almost a panicked flutter, a desperate drumming against her ribs. I could feel her tiny, frantic tremors where her leg touched mine, a silent plea for help. And the fear was a cold, sharp thing in my own chest, a physical vice squeezing the air right out of me. We were maybe 2 blocks from the emergency room entrance, the kind of distance where you can already taste the faint, metallic, sterile air and hear the distant, cyclical wail of an ambulance approaching the ER bay, the promise of help so close it was agonizing. But then this wall of steel, this imposing, inhuman piece of machinery, just slid right in front of the intersection. No flashers, no warning, just this absolute arrogant stop that defied logic, law, and basic human decency, treating the entire street like its private driveway. I hit the horn, not just tapping it once or twice, but leaning on it, holding it down, until my palm was numb and throbbing, creating a useless, frantic noise. But the tinted window didn't even twitch, showing zero acknowledgement that a world of human urgency existed outside its bubble of quiet luxury. I could feel the precious minutes slipping away, like sand through my fingers, each second feeling like 10, the limited oxygen tank in the passenger seat, not quite keeping up with Evelyn's shallow, panicked breaths. And the absolute animal rage that took over my common sense was the purest emotion I'd ever known, stronger than any fear, stronger than the instinct to flee. I didn't think. I acted on instinct alone. I flung the driver's side door open, the old metal protesting with a loud, rusty groan that sounded pathetic against the quiet power of the SUV, didn't even bother to put the emergency brake on the car, still vibrating slightly with its idling engine, and just ran up to that window, my knuckles rapping hard enough to leave a dent, screaming for him to move his damn car. I wasn't asking. I was demanding, spitting the words out through clenched teeth, my voice raw and loud, because right then my little sister's life was worth more than whatever important meeting the jerk inside was having, and the desperation stripped away every layer of self-preservation, making me completely fearless, in a way I didn't even know I possessed, truly ready to die for those 2 minutes of road. I pounded again, harder this time, feeling the vibration travel up my arm, a reckless act fueled by pure adrenaline and adrenaline alone. And then the rear door of the SUV opened just a crack, slow and ominous, like the lid of a heavy coffin, and this big guy in a tailored suit built like a brick wall stepped out. But he didn't even look at me, didn't spare me a single glance or a moment of attention. He dismissed me with his body language alone. He just leaned back into the car, his posture communicating a silent question. What is this insignificant noise disturbing our quiet hanging in the air? And then the driver's window finally rolled down, slow and deliberate, like a heavy velvet curtain being drawn back on a stage to reveal the star. I stopped shouting instantly because the man in the driver's seat wasn't just a man. He was something cold and perfectly sculpted, carved from granite and ice, with eyes that didn't just look at you. They didn't even acknowledge you as a genuine threat. They assessed your structural weakness, calculating the precise point where you would break, and how much pressure would be required to do it efficiently. I remember the air going thin in my lungs, suddenly feeling dizzy as I stood there face to face with Leo Moretti, though I didn't know his name yet. I only knew that the temperature in the street had just dropped about 30 degrees, pulling all the warmth and light out of the afternoon sun, replacing it with chill. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch, didn't even move a single muscle, just stared right past the grease on my hands, the frantic pulse beating visibly in my throat, and the raw panic on my face. And he said with a voice that was low, perfectly controlled, but carried the undeniable weight of a judge's gavel and a lifetime of authority, "You have no idea who you're shouting at." And the utter finality of that statement, the deep resonant tone of it, should have sent me running, scrambling back to my car, but I just held my ground, pointing back at my car, where Evelyn was struggling, refusing to break eye contact, refusing to let him see the fear that was trying to swallow me whole and consume my resolve. Then the laughter started, not from him. Leo remained utterly still, utterly composed, a statue of contempt, but from the men standing around, leaning against the neighboring luxury cars, all dressed in the same expensive dark clothes, their faces slick with amusement at my sheer misplaced stupidity. "This girl really has no sense of danger?" one of them drawled, and another younger one pulled out his phone, holding it up to film the scene with a predatory gleam in his eye, shouting something in their direction that was instantly picked up by the small crowd that had started gathering on the sidewalk, sensing a spectacle. They were all murmuring their voices, quickly turning ugly, and the words were cutting and ugly even from a distance carried on the breeze. "She yelled at a mafia boss. She's insane. And, look at that cheap car, she's going to get herself killed for being late to the hospital, not to mention insulting his time." They were dissecting me, the bystanders, the people filming, whispering about my little beat-up Honda, the obvious oil stain on my t-shirt that I hadn't noticed that morning, the chipped paint on my nails, judging me, dismissing me entirely as unworthy of notice, deciding I was just some low-class idiot picking a fight I couldn't possibly win, and the deep, burning humiliation of being seen and mocked by these people, who seemed to exist on a different plane of existence, who had everything I didn't, was almost as sharp as the fear for Evelyn's worsening condition. The contempt was a physical thing wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating blanket that made it hard to breathe, making my lungs ache. I swallowed down the shame and the rising terror, forcing it back down with sheer willpower, channeling it into an aggressive stillness. And I just stood there, arms crossed now, adopting a posture of stubborn, unyielding resistance, refusing to look away from his eyes, not backing down even a fraction of an inch, because backing down meant acknowledging that his time, his schedule, his ego was more important than my sister's life, and that was a moral calculation I was never ever going to make. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity, just watched me, his expression fixed, and I saw a flicker not of anger, which would have been predictable and easy to handle, but of something else, something cold and analytical, like a scientist observing a particularly aggressive insect that refuses to be crushed, noting its strange vitality, its unexpected resilience. He was studying my defiance, recording it, and that clinical curiosity was more unsettling than any outright threat of violence. Finally, he gave a slow, barely perceptible nod to the man who had stepped out, and was now back in the driver's seat. Leo didn't say another word to me, didn't offer an apology or even a gesture of pity. He just rolled the window back up, cutting me off with that opaque glass, sealing himself away, and the massive vehicle moved, inching forward just enough for me to pull around the obstacle. I stumbled back to my car, wrenched the door open, slammed it shut, and finished the last 2 blocks in a fevered, frantic dash. The image of his face, the coldness in his eyes burned into my memory. But the second I saw Evelyn wheeled into the triage area, surrounded by nurses and bright hospital lights, the only thing that mattered was the steadying, life-affirming sound of the hospital machines and the immediate blessed attention she received. Look, I know this is a heavy story, and sometimes, when you're going through things that feel impossible, where you have to fight uphill every step of the way, you just need a moment of connection, right? If you're watching this, and you've felt that kind of crushing pressure, that relentless moment where you have to fight for someone you love or fight for your own dignity, please just take a second to open your phone right now. Like the video, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It helps me feel less alone in sharing this, and hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep sharing these real stories, the ones about heartbreak, and fighting back, about being underestimated, and finally seen. And I'd be honored if you'd walk with me through the rest of this journey. Thank you, truly. The immediate aftermath of the hospital confrontation felt surreal, like the world hadn't quite caught up to what I'd done. like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Not just an ordinary shoe, but a heavy steel-toed boot about to crush everything I cared about. I spent the next 24 hours alternating between sitting beside Evelyn's bed, listening to the rhythmic, comforting monitor beep that signaled stability, and obsessively checking my phone to see if anyone had posted that video. They had, of course, and the comments were brutal. A relentless stream of negativity, calling me everything from a gold digger to a crazy person, or worse, making lewd jokes about what I would have to do to apologize to him and avoid the consequences, but mostly just ridiculing my desperation and my humble stained clothes, gleefully predicting my immediate demise. I tried to push it all down, forcing myself to focus on the soft mechanical hum of the hospital, the medicinal smell of sterile wipes and cleaning solution, and the delicate rise and fall of Evelyn's chest, telling myself that it was over, that I'd faced the monster and somehow survived through sheer dumb luck. But I hadn't survived. I'd only earned a brief stay of execution, a pause in the inevitable, and that quiet dread, that terrible mounting feeling that something organized and terrifying was coming for me, settled deep in my stomach, a persistent cold ache that made it hard to swallow food or allow myself the luxury of sleep. I kept turning over his face in my mind, that cold, bored, supremely indifferent expression, wondering why he hadn't just crushed me right there in the street, with a single word or gesture, because his prolonged silence and his terrifying patience felt infinitely more dangerous than any overt threat he could have made. It felt like he was preparing something elaborate. Then that night, just after I finally convinced myself to go home, shower and change into something clean, a moment of stolen, exhausted normalcy, before rushing back to the hospital, they showed up. I was turning the key in the lock of my small, cramped apartment, the one above the garage where I worked, and the tiny metallic sound of my key clicking in the tumbler felt deafening in the otherwise quiet street, when 4 black SUVs, the same kind of ridiculously massive identical vehicles from the confrontation, silently materialized and lined up along the curb. They didn't roll up casually. They were stationed, positioned with military precision, flanking my doorway, a fleet of expensive black predators that had tracked me down and cornered me without a single sound or screech of tires. The sheer number of them, the quiet, terrifying efficiency of their arrival, the way they instantly changed the atmosphere of the entire block, made my hand shake so badly I almost dropped the keys, and the cold metal felt slick in my palm. I stopped breathing, just froze on the doorstep, the single hallway light behind me casting a long, vulnerable shadow, staring at the darkened, opaque windows, waiting, because I knew this wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a warning. This was the reckoning that had been promised, delivered straight to my door. The streetlights seemed to dim just around them, swallowed by the darkness of their vehicles, and the entire neighborhood felt completely silent, as if the whole world, every sleeping neighbor, every passing car was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen to the insignificant girl who dared to yell at the man who owned the city. One of the SUV doors opened, a heavy, solid sound in the quiet night, and Leo Moretti stepped out, tall and shadowed, wearing the same impeccable, custom-tailored suit that looked impossibly smooth in the dim light. But the silence he brought with him felt heavier than before, charged with expectation and a chilling sense of purpose. He didn't walk fast, didn't make a sound, just moved with this slow, inevitable grace, and he stopped about 10 feet away from me, allowing the distance to be a stage for his power, forcing me to approach. His expression was exactly what I remembered, unreadable, cold, the kind of stillness that suggests absolute, unchallenged power, like the deep ocean right before a storm. He didn't offer a greeting or a threat, just stared right into me for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until I could hear the frantic blood pounding in my ears. And then he spoke, his voice carrying just enough to cut through the quiet night air, making every syllable a pronouncement of ownership. "You owe me an apology," he stated, not as a polite request, but as a statement of undisputed fact, demanding retribution for the insult I had flung at him. In public, demanding that I acknowledge his superiority and my own mistake. And I felt that familiar surge of defiance, the one that had helped me survive my whole life, push past the fresh wave of fear and exhaustion. I met his gaze and tightened my grip on the strap of my messenger bag, the one I always carried my tools in, the worn fabric offering a small, tangible anchor in the surging fear. and even though my legs felt like water, like they might give out any second, I somehow managed to stand taller, refusing to shrink under his gaze. "Show me where it says I'm not allowed to speak to you?" I challenged him, my voice barely a whisper, but firm, refusing to play his game of bowing and scraping, holding my dignity above his demands, even if it was the last thing I ever did. The sheer foolish audacity of my response seemed to momentarily surprise the men standing near the cars. I heard a slight shift of their weight, a subtle rustle of expensive fabric, an almost imperceptible change in the air. But Leo's face remained impassive, only the faintest narrowing of his eyes, indicating he had registered the challenge and the refusal to submit. He paused again, a deliberate, calculated silence that was terrifyingly potent, and then he did the one thing that truly shattered my composure, the thing that brought me to my knees, mentally ending the fight before it even began. He glanced towards the upstairs window where I knew Evelyn was still waiting for me, and he started talking about her, but not in generalities. He named her exact medical condition, the specific rare complex name for her heart issue, something only her doctors, the specialist at the regional center. And I knew something no outsider, especially not a man I'd screamed at 24 hours earlier, should have possibly known, revealing the immediate chilling extent of his power and his reach into my private life, a level of surveillance that made my skin crawl. The blood drained from my face instantly, a visceral, sickening drop that left me cold and dizzy, and the terror that hit me this time was paralyzing, a deep primal fear, because it wasn't about me anymore, my safety or my humiliation. It was solely, utterly about Evelyn, the one person I had to protect. He had invaded the one sanctuary I thought I had found, the one weakness I protected above all else, the most fragile piece of my world, and he hadn't even had to break a sweat to find it and expose it. He took a single step closer, closing the distance between us, until I could feel the cold radiating off his perfectly tailored suit, and the air around him felt charged, metallic, and dangerous. Then he reached out, not brutally, not with a snatch, but with a horrifying gentleness, a complete violation of my personal space, and he took my wrist in his hand, his long, powerful fingers encircling it completely, a firm, non-negotiable grip that felt like a promise of safety, and a profound threat all at once, a physical manifestation of his complete ownership over my immediate future. His eyes, fixed on mine, were dark and deep, like bottomless wells of shadow, and his voice dropped even lower, becoming an intimate, terrifying sound meant only for my ears. From this moment on, he murmured, his thumb brushing lightly across my pulse point, feeling the rapid, terrified beat of my heart. "You're under my watch. Get in the car." He wasn't giving me a choice. He was simply relocating me, asserting his power. And in that moment, I understood he hadn't been drawn to my foolishness or my fire, but to my vulnerability, and he now held the leverage he needed to ensure my absolute obedience. And there wasn't a single thing I could do but surrender and follow him into the sleek, black interior of his world. The drive to his estate was silent, the kind of silence where every mile feels like 1,000, where the road ahead seems endless, and the tension in the car was so thick I could practically chew on it, the air itself heavy with unspoken threats, and the weight of my terrible situation. I sat rigid, staring out the window, watching the city lights of my familiar, struggling world shrink beneath us as we ascended, feeling the literal gap widening between my old life and this terrifying new one. When we finally arrived, the Moretti mansion wasn't just large. It was overwhelming, a sprawling historic edifice of dark, cold stone and acres of manicured glass that sat atop a high hill like a medieval fortress, overseeing and dominating the entire glittering city I worked so hard just to scrape a living in. The sheer scale was meant to intimidate. The opulence was jarring, the kind of wealth that screams power history and generations of crime, and the moment I stepped out of the SUV, I felt the cold, critical gaze of every person present, the silent, immediate judgment like spotlights dissecting every flaw in my appearance. This was the second humiliation, the one where I was dragged onto their turf, away from my humble garage and my sick sister, and forced to exist, however briefly, in a world that saw me as nothing more than a stain on their perfect marble floors, a piece of common dirt tracked in from the outside. My work boots felt heavy and wrong on the pristine paving stones, echoing loudly in the immense space, and my worn denim jacket with its faint, honest smell of oil and solvent was a stark, embarrassing contrast to the silk and cashmere worn by the people milling about, making me feel physically smaller, weaker, and completely out of place, an obvious intrusion. As I was ushered through massive ornate halls, past priceless artwork and statues that looked down on me with cold indifference, the mockery was immediate and palpable, delivered not with outright insults, which would have been easier to bear and fight, but with glances, snickers, and dismissive whispers that were intended to wound deeply and systematically. One of Moretti's men, a tall guy with a sneer that seemed permanently etched onto his face, and who wore a watch that probably cost more than my entire life. Savings leaned over to another, not bothering to lower his voice as I passed. Boss picked up a new pet. He drawled, his eyes sweeping over my body with insulting contempt, lingering longest on my calloused hands, the hands of a working woman, and the word pet felt like a physical blow, shrinking me down to something utterly insignificant, a creature to be kept in a cage and easily disposable when its novelty wore off. The socialites' women, dripping in diamonds and flawless makeup, their hair perfectly coiffed, gave me the most withering appraisals of all, sizing me up and down like I was a piece of cheap furniture that had somehow been misplaced in a priceless showroom, their expressions a mixture of disgust and bored amusement. She looks like a mechanic. Did he find her under a car? I mean, look at those nails. One whispered to her companion, her voice laced with pure disgust, and the companion just laughed, a thin, brittle sound that echoed through the marble entryway, confirming that in their world being a mechanic, being working class, was the ultimate punchline, a badge of shame that disqualified me from even existing in the same air. They breathed a fundamental disqualification from life itself. They made me stand for what felt like hours in a shadowed corner of a vast, silent library, away from the immediate action, while Leo conducted a meeting in the adjacent dimly lit room, a room dominated by dark wood, the heavy, expensive smell of leather, and the palpable weight of serious business decisions. I was being treated like a worthless object, a literal potted plant, something dangerous enough to require a guard stationed discreetly nearby, but insignificant enough to be completely ignored by the participants. I could clearly hear Leo's voice through the partially open doors, cold and commanding, discussing something that sounded incredibly important: territory lines, profit numbers, and the precise consequences for insubordination decisions that affected the lives and deaths of hundreds of people in the city. At one point, one of his main advisors, a sharp, nervous-looking man, whose eyes darted around the room, constantly clearly worried about my unexpected and unprecedented presence, gestured towards me with a subtle head movement, asking Leo for clarification. Leo's response, delivered with zero inflection, with the same flatness he would use to order a coffee or dismiss a subordinate, was like a knife twist in my gut, humiliating me completely. "She's harmless," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judgment, reducing me to an afterthought, and the way he dismissed me, minimizing my entire existence to a non-threat, a thing of no consequence, made the blood rush to my face in burning humiliation. I wasn't just overlooked. I was actively categorized as irrelevant, utterly powerless, and every instinct in me screamed against being labeled so casually, so cruelly, by the one man who now held my sister's safety in his hands, using her as silent leverage to control me. I didn't move or react, just stood there, forcing myself to be a literal shadow against the dark wood paneling, willing myself to become invisible, forcing my gaze to the floor. But my hands were clenched so tightly in the pockets of my jacket that my nails were digging deep into my palms, leaving painful red crescents in the skin. That night felt like the longest night of my life, trapped in a golden cage, surrounded by mocking luxury and casual cruelty, and the only thing that stopped me from walking out, marching down the hill, and facing the inevitable consequences of defiance, was the fragile memory of Evelyn's frail hand in mine, and the terrifying knowledge that Leo could make her vanish from this life just as easily as he had found her medical records. After what seemed like an endless wait, stretching into the early hours of the morning, the meeting finally broke up, the men filtering out with nervous, deferential nods and low, calculating voices, and Leo finally came over to me, his sheer physical presence immediately dominating the quiet corner I'd been hiding in. He didn't apologize for the insults, the weight, or the casual cruelty. He just looked at me, his dark eyes assessing my reaction, searching for tears or a breakdown, trying to gauge how thoroughly broken I was, and I braced myself for the next round of psychological warfare, ready to endure whatever twisted game he wanted to play with the humble mechanic he'd dragged into his mansion, fully expecting him to demand a formal, groveling apology now. But what happened next was the second twist in the story, the one that pulled me off balance, completely shattering my expectations of predictable power games. He didn't take me to another silk-draped formal room. Instead, he led me down a series of dark, winding stone staircases that felt ancient and cold, echoing with our footsteps deep beneath the house, until we reached a place that smelled distinctly of oil metal and time, a place that resonated with my own world, a sanctuary of mechanics. When the heavy reinforced door finally groaned open, revealing the cavernous space beyond, I realized we were in a massive underground garage that looked more like a museum, a pristine, climate-controlled tomb filled with some of the most beautiful, flawlessly preserved vintage cars I had ever seen, each one a testament to engineering history and passion. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Here, away from the diamond-covered parasites and the crushing judgment of the estate, the air felt real, grounded, and smelled like honest technical work, and for the first time since he'd grabbed my wrist, I felt a flicker of my true self, my professional self return. He walked past rows of gleaming masterpieces, each one perfect, and stopped in front of one specific car, a rare, perfectly preserved 1960s model, its cherry red paint dulled by age, but still breathtaking in its elegant design. And I knew instantly that this was no ordinary vehicle. This was a shrine, a relic of immense personal importance that held a story. He finally broke the silence, his voice raw, stripped of the cold metallic authority he usually wore, sounding almost like a normal man in pain, the sound of a heavy burden being momentarily released, and he started talking about his mother. He told me in clipped, difficult sentences, the kind that cost him something physically to say about the car explosion. Not just the cold technical details I could have found in a police report, but the actual sound of the blast, the terrible, final, sickening smell of burning metal and rubber, and how it had happened right in front of him 20 years ago, when he was just a kid, scarring him forever and robbing him of all warmth. He didn't cry or shout. He just spoke with this devastating, quiet burden, explaining that the car in front of us, this beautiful relic, was his mother's favorite, the one she loved to drive on sunny days, and that it had been locked away ever since, untouched. A morbid memorial to a life violently ended, a symbol of his failure to protect her. He described her as fierce, protective, and utterly independent, qualities I recognized. And as he spoke, he turned to me, and for the first time I saw genuine pain, a vulnerability so deep it was almost an open wound, a chasm of sorrow. And then he said, the strangest thing, the reason he had shown up at my door that night, the answer to the whole terrifying puzzle. He said my eyes, stained with oil and filled with a desperate protective fire that day, on the street, resembled his mother's eyes in old photographs he kept hidden away, and that it was the first time in 20 years that he had felt anything but a terrifying, necessary numbness, a void he had carefully cultivated to survive his world. And I was the unexpected catalyst for feeling again. I stood there utterly speechless, letting his confession hang in the cold, perfect air of the garage, the mechanical silence broken only by our breathing, finally understanding that his claim over me wasn't about cheap power or simple desire, but about a deep structural wound that had never healed, and a moment of rare, terrifying trust he was bestowing, seeing in me a reflection of the only pure thing he'd ever lost. He led me to a high-tech console mounted on the wall and showed me surveillance files, cold black and white proof that he had checked my entire background, my work hours, Evelyn's medical records, my desperate financial struggles, everything from the moment I'd yelled at him on the street, revealing the terrifying efficiency and depth of his world. He didn't trust me, not truly, because trust was a weakness in his world, but he was fascinated by me, and the shared thread of the dead mother. The protective fire was the only currency I had, the unexpected bridge between our two impossible lives, a fragile link forged in trauma. Then he pointed to the vintage car, his voice regaining a touch of its familiar authority. But the request was almost a plea, a test of faith in my skill and my soul. He asked me to fix it, to bring the engine back to life, to make it run again, explaining that no one else was allowed to touch it, that it had remained sacred all these years. And in that moment, I knew that this impossible task was the only apology he would accept, and the only way I could secure Evelyn's safety and carve out a small protected space for her in this terrifying empire. I got to work immediately, completely immersed in the familiar smell of gasoline-worn leather and high-octane racing fuel pulling tools from my worn messenger bag, the comfort of the cold steel familiar in my hands, and the relentless tension of the previous hours began to bleed away as I focused on the intricate mechanical puzzle of the classic V8 engine. Working on that beautiful engine, troubleshooting the fuel line, replacing the rusted parts with surgical precision, calibrating the timing was my solace. The only place where the noise of the outside world, the insults, and the danger couldn't reach me. And I felt the familiar, quiet strength of my skill return, a competence that couldn't be judged by my clothes or my bank account. I didn't care that it was a 60s classic, a priceless artifact. An engine is an engine, and I understood its logic, its demands, its internal language better than I understood the twisted logic of the Mafia world, finding comfort in the predictable, truthful nature of metal and fire. While I worked, Leo didn't leave. He just stood at the edge of the light, leaning against a cold stone pillar, watching me with a terrible, patient stillness, his presence a heavy, quiet weight. His eyes were dark and dangerous, not the eyes of a lover, but the eyes of a guardian, a careful predator silently observing every precise movement of my hands, every bead of sweat on my forehead, every flicker of concentration, learning my rhythm, perhaps searching for the flaw he knew existed in everything. He never spoke, never rushed me, just stood there, and the quiet, heavy weight of his gaze was a constant pressure, a reminder that I was working for the most dangerous man in the city. But it was also a strange, unexpected kind of comfort, because for the first time, someone with real power was truly seeing my skill, my intellect, my worth, not just dismissing my dirt-stained clothes or my humble background. The brief period of relative peace in the garage didn't last, of course. The world of the Mafia doesn't allow for quiet moments of focused work or emotional stability, especially when a man like Leo has shown a flicker of human interest. Damian Cross, the leader of a rival gang, saw my confrontation with Leo and the subsequent silence from the Moretti camp as an opportunity to strike not at Leo's territory, which was heavily fortified, but at his reputation and his pride, exploiting the perceived weakness that I represented. The third wave of humiliation came in the form of a viciously edited video clip that Damian leaked across all the underground forums and gossip sites, splicing my frantic screaming with slow-motion shots of Leo's cold face, then adding graphic fictional subtitles about our supposed arrangement and the price I was supposedly paying. The clip was captioned in bold, mocking letters, "Mafia boss humiliated by some girl from nowhere. Now she's his whore," and it went viral instantly within their toxic ecosystem, reaching a wider, more public audience this time, spreading the poisonous lies like disease. The initial ridicule was nothing compared to the coordinated character assassination that followed, fueled by Damian's desire to destabilize Leo by making him look weak, lovesick, and human, dependent on a common girl. This time the mockery wasn't just about my class. It was about my character, my virtue, and it cut deep because it came from someone I thought I could trust, my coworker Cole Rivers. Cole, whom I had always treated like a friend, whose shifts I had covered countless times when he claimed a sudden illness, and who had often watched Evelyn when I couldn't afford a sitter, or needed to work overtime, publicly humiliated me on social media. He posted a rambling, spiteful message, clearly drunk on the sudden toxic attention he was getting, writing, "She begged me for a raise last month, literally crying about her medical bills. Dirt poor, and now pretending to date a Mafia boss for a handout. She's a joke, always looking for a handout, and now she's a gold digger who slept her way to the top. I saw her looking through the client files, she's a sneak." The sheer raw cruelty of his words, the way he twisted my genuine, agonizing struggle to pay Evelyn's medical bills into a narrative of greed and utter desperation, felt like the ultimate final betrayal, a violation of the unspoken code of the working class, a punch from someone standing right next to me. It was one thing to be judged by strangers, It was another to have someone I shared a tiny oil-stained workspace with turn on me for a few minutes of online notoriety and a handful of cash. My private struggles, the quiet dignity I had tried to maintain through years of grinding, exhausting work, were suddenly exposed and weaponized, and the shame, the feeling of being completely naked and exposed to the world's worst assumptions was unbearable, making me feel physically ill and lightheaded with anger. Worst of all, Evelyn got dragged into the toxic spotlight too, her delicate health made into a public spectacle that terrified me more than any threat to myself. Underground bloggers and gossip columnists, hungry for any dirt on Leo, and seeing Evelyn as a soft target, started referring to her as the Mafia's new prey, painting a grotesque picture of an innocent girl being used as collateral or leverage in a dark, twisted game. The onslaught of attention was terrifying, threatening to shatter the fragile recovery she was making her vulnerable in ways I couldn't bear to think about, and I felt utterly helpless, unable to shield her from the venomous world I had accidentally stumbled into. The silence from the Moretti mansion was the final, soul-crushing blow. I waited anxiously, refreshing my phone screen in the dim light of the garage, hoping Leo would issue some simple statement, some quiet denial to protect me and Evelyn from the lies and the slander. But he didn't. He stayed absolutely silent, and that silence combined with his advisor's earlier comment that I was harmless made me feel completely abandoned, like I was sinking in quicksand while the only person who could save me watched dispassionately from the shore, prioritizing his image over my defense. I was trapped between two warring factions, used as a weapon by one and treated as disposable collateral by the other, and the realization that Leo wouldn't lift a finger to defend my honor, even after my intense, focused work on his mother's sacred car, made the tears well up in my eyes, and I felt the familiar crushing weight of being small and unimportant settle over me once again, heavier than ever before. But that moment of despair, that feeling of being completely alone and defenseless with the world closing in, was the turning point, the moment the mechanic in me took over the emotional woman, pushing aside the fear and the shame. When I finally wiped the tears away with a greasy rag, the scent of oil and gasoline oddly grounding, bringing me back to reality, I didn't see a victim in the reflection of the vintage car's polished hood. I saw a resourceful engineer who had always found a way out of impossible situations by relying on logic, not luck or emotion. My mind, which had been clouded by emotion and shame, suddenly clicked back into its rational problem-solving mode, the way it always did when I faced a broken, complicated engine, and I started thinking like a mechanic looking for the weak point in the system, the faulty connection that was causing the leak. I realized that Cole's sudden, dramatic, and perfectly targeted betrayal felt too convenient, too perfectly timed, like he was following a script written by someone else, and I started connecting the dots back to Damien, realizing the public attack was merely a smokescreen for something deeper, something rooted in corporate theft and industrial sabotage. The answer, I quickly deduced, had to be in the workshop's private network, the place where I had felt safest. Using my deep knowledge of the workshop's archaic computer system, the one I had personally built, maintained and often cursed for its complexity, I began a quiet, methodical, and intense digital investigation from the safety of the mansion's garage, working late into the night, while Leo watched unaware of my true work. It didn't take long for me to discover the horrifying truth: Cole hadn't betrayed me for fame. He had betrayed the workshop for a substantial amount of cold, hard cash, selling proprietary data and schematics, my actual designs, years of my original work, to Damien's rival organization. This was no emotional grudge or drunken rant. It was high-stakes industrial espionage, and it explained the timing and the viciousness of the public attack, which was clearly meant to distract from the real crime. I spent the next 48 hours submerged in the digital evidence, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, the solitude of the garage. My only companion using my engineering skills to bypass Cole's weak encryption methods, decoding security camera footage that showed him meeting secretly with one of Damien's lieutenants, and meticulously documenting the paper trail of secret money transfers that confirmed the payoff, showing the dates, times, and amounts. This wasn't revenge. This was survival. The reassertion of control and the cold, hard logic of the code brought back the strength I had lost in the face of emotional cruelty, giving me an unassailable position built on concrete proof. When I finally had the full dossier neatly organized, cross-referenced, and undeniable, I marched into Leo's office, not the underground garage, but his main office overlooking the city. And without a word, I laid the evidence printed out and bound in a clean professional folder on his massive mahogany desk. Leo looked at the digital trail I had compiled, the complex network of data theft and betrayal, the undeniable proof of his rival's underhanded dealings, and the cold, unreadable mask he usually wore finally cracked, replaced by a momentary flash of shock and undeniable respect for my competence. He was stunned not just by the evidence, but by the sheer undeniable fact that the harmless girl, the mechanic, everyone dismissed, had been smart enough, resourceful enough, and bold enough to find it and confront him with it, solving a problem his entire security detail and network of spies had somehow missed. He picked up the folder, flipped through the pages rapidly, his eyes scanning the technical language and the financial transfers, confirming its validity instantly. But before he could speak, before he could offer a word of praise or thanks, I preempted him and set my condition, making sure he understood this was a transaction between equals, a professional deal. I leaned across the desk, my hands flat on the polished wood, meeting his gaze with the full intensity of the fire he claimed to see in my eyes, ensuring he understood the gravity of my demand. "Protect Evelyn," I told him, my voice low and firm, a steady, unbreakable command. "Before you protect me, make sure that nothing, not a single blog post, anonymous threat, or whisper of this world reaches her. Her safety is absolutely paramount, the one thing I will not compromise. That's the deal. Her safety is the price of this information." And in that moment, I became more than just a girl to him. I became a formidable negotiator, someone who didn't just ask for protection, but demanded it, and who valued her family's safety above her own, a currency more valuable and rare than any amount of money or loyalty in his world. He didn't answer right away, just kept staring at me, his eyes searching mine, testing the sincerity and the firmness of my resolve, a faint shadow of a smile touching the corner of his mouth, a gesture of almost pride. And the silence was heavy, but different this time. It was the silence of consideration, not contempt or dominance, but of a strategy shifting. No one, absolutely no one, bargains with a mafia boss, especially not one of his pets. And the sheer audacity of my demand was clearly registering as a kind of structural flaw in his initial assumption about me, a strength he had fatally underestimated. He finally gave a slow nod, a deeply weighted gesture of respect. I hadn't expected, and accepted the terms, understanding that my love for my sister was the greatest power I possessed, and he would use his resources to guard it, recognizing the tactical advantage of protecting my weakness. From there, we worked together, side by side, moving past the awkwardness of our power dynamic, though the arrangement was purely strategic and tactical, at first plotting the downfall of our mutual enemies with cold, calculated precision. We devised a trap using the evidence I found to convince Damien that Cole had betrayed him, instead that Cole was a desperate double agent who had intentionally leaked the humiliating video as a distraction to lure Damien into a faulty data deal. The scheme was brutally efficient and rooted entirely in the cold, hard paranoia and mistrust that governed the underworld. Leo made sure Cole was where Damien could find him, creating a calculated situation where the two men, fueled by mistrust, greed, and a mutual history of violence, turned on each other and eliminated themselves, all without Leo or me having to fire a single shot, using their own corruption against them and letting them implode. The aftermath was messy, swift, and absolute. And as I watched the news reports, two powerful, toxic men suddenly gone in a blaze of their own, making the chilling realization sank in. I had just used my brain and my engineering skills to help a mafia boss orchestrate a lethal outcome, and I hadn't even blinked the necessity of it overriding any moral squeamishness I might have once possessed. The consequences of our strategic partnership, though successful in neutralizing a major threat, were immediate and dangerous to Leo's reputation and my own tenuous position. Rumors began to spread like wildfire throughout the tightly controlled circles of the Moretti organization and the rival gangs who had witnessed Damien's chaotic downfall. "Leo Moretti has gone soft." The whispers carried echoing through the vast, cold halls of the mansion, now laced with genuine anxiety and concern for the future of the empire. "A woman is his weakness. He risked a key lieutenant's life for a girl. He is compromised. He is no longer the cold leader we need. His own men, the ones who had mocked me and called me a pet, were the most vocal in their fear, whispering about the instability of the empire and the potential for a vacuum of power, that Leo was losing his edge. The empire will fall if Boss gets distracted by a girl, especially one so common. The streets are talking, saying he is trading blood for sentiment. I heard one of them mutter during a late-night security briefing. I was not meant to hear their concern entirely practical entirely, without malice toward me, but terrifyingly clear. Nonetheless, I was simply an unacceptable risk to their established order, a human flaw in a perfectly ruthless machine. I was no longer just a mechanic. I was a glaring vulnerability, a hole in the armor of a man who could not afford to be vulnerable, and a sign of imminent disorder. Damien, before his final fatal move, sent one last chilling message, a cryptic note delivered by an anonymous messenger that cut straight to the heart of the matter, forcing Leo to choose, forcing a public reckoning. The note, scrawled on expensive dark paper, simply read, "Empire or woman, choose. The world is watching." The threat was clear. If Leo chose me, he would be choosing his downfall, inviting war and collapse, demonstrating he was unfit to lead, and the entire underworld was indeed watching, waiting to see which side of the ancient cruel code he would fall on. The pressure was immense, pressing down on Leo from all sides, from his enemies and his own nervous men, and I saw the crushing strain on him, the way his jaw would tighten until the muscles looked like cords of steel, the darkness and deep exhaustion in his eyes when he thought no one was watching him, in the solitude of his office, pacing back and forth, in the pre-dawn hours, wrestling with the impossible choice. Then came the moment that truly broke my heart, the fourth humiliation, the one that made me feel like an ultimate, unforgivable liability, erasing all the courage and intellect I had shown. I was waiting outside his private study, pretending to look at a centuries-old tapestry on the wall, the heavy fabric feeling cold and rough under my fingertips, when I heard him talking to his most trusted advisor, the man who had questioned my harmlessness. His voice was low, devoid of emotion, the voice of a man making a necessary sacrifice for the greater good, cold and clinical. But the words were devastatingly clear, tearing through my hope like a shard of ice. I can't let her become my weakness. I won't let them use her to kill me and destroy everything. I have to secure the future of the family, he stated the declaration, feeling like a hammer blow against the fragile connection we had built, confirming all my fears that duty and survival would always win over sentiment. I didn't need to hear anything else. The words were the final word on the matter, the dismissal I had been dreading. I walked away, before his advisor could reply, the weight of his statement crushing me, because I understood the reality of his world, a reality that prioritized power survival and the cold continuation of the organization above all else. I realized his intention wasn't to kill me, but to sever all ties, to exile me to safety, so he could regain his ruthless standing. In the Mafia, love isn't a shelter or a strength. It's a bullseye painted on your back, and every enemy knows that the fastest way to destroy the man is to wound, capture, or kill the woman he cares about. I felt trapped, reduced once again to a strategic liability, nothing more than a potential cost-benefit analysis for his sprawling, bloody empire, a variable that needed to be removed from the equation. The romantic, fleeting idea that he might see me as a true permanent partner, as someone strong enough to stand beside him and defy the rules, dissolved instantly, replaced by the grim, cold knowledge that I was merely a ticking time bomb, a source of potential destruction he might one day have to neutralize or abandon to save his world. I retreated back to the garage and the vintage car, the only place where the weight of his impossible choice couldn't reach me, preparing myself for the inevitable moment when he would push me away, proving to his world that he was still the cold, calculating, and unfeeling leader they needed to survive. But Leo Moretti was not a man who followed expectations. Or perhaps he was a man who had finally realized that his own rules were the only true weakness, the barrier between him and a genuine life. And the final, most stunning twist came during the annual summit of the 12 major gang leaders, a gathering steeped in tradition, power, and silent, thinly veiled threats. The entire atmosphere was a pressure cooker designed to test him. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with cigar smoke, and unstated ambition. The room filled with the men who controlled the city's dark underbelly, each one assessing Leo's stability and silently deciding if they should move against him, now that he had displayed this apparent weakness. I was there too, brought in under heavy guard, forced to stand against a remote wall where I was once again subjected to the judgmental, predatory stares of the other leaders and their entourage, the whispers about my poverty and my scandalous connection to Leo ringing louder than ever. I kept my head down, focusing on the texture of my messenger bag, ready to be humiliated, ready for Leo to finally make his choice and send me away to save himself and his empire, bracing for the necessary break. Then, just as the meeting was about to begin, just as the atmosphere reached its peak of silent judgment, Leo did the unthinkable an act that defied every single rule of the underworld, one that challenged the very foundation of his power. He didn't send me away or ignore me. He walked across the vast room, a long, deliberate walk, past the tables of men who were plotting his downfall, his every step echoing in the silence, and stopped right in front of me. He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and warm, pulling me forward not gently, but with a firm, decisive motion that commanded the immediate and absolute attention of the entire room, forcing me to stand directly at his side, facing the full, terrifying weight of the assembled underworld. His voice, when he finally spoke, resonated through the cavernous hall, cold and absolute, amplified by the total silence cutting through the expectation like a gunshot. "Touch her," he declared, his gaze sweeping slowly and deliberately across the faces of the gang leaders, locking eyes with each one, daring them to object his power, now amplified by the public display of commitment. "And you die." "She's not a weakness. She's my equal. She is the foundation." The hall fell silent, truly silent this time, the kind of absolute stillness that marks a fundamental, irreversible shift in the world's structure, a moment where history turns and old rules crumble. Gasps could be heard, and the older boss's faces turned to stone, unable to comprehend the scale of his defiance. No mafia boss, not in decades, had ever elevated an outsider, let alone a woman from a humble background, who had publicly screamed at him, to this level of respect and protection, announcing her value as equal to his own. It was an act of profound defiance, a direct challenge to centuries of patriarchal tradition, and a refusal to play by the rules of caution. Then, completely ignoring the stunned, outraged faces of his peers and the open threat they represented, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in dark velvet. It was the Iron Goddess emblem, a symbol reserved only for the person who stands officially at the boss's side, the sign of a recognized partner in all things, not just love, but power, counsel, and war, a mark of absolute trust. He unwrapped the emblem and placed the heavy, cold metal into my palm, his fingers closing over mine, sealing the bond, and the weight of it felt monumental, the official acknowledgement of my strength, my intelligence, and the courage I had shown in fighting for my sister. And then, as the ultimate act of disrespect to the tradition-bound bosses, he pulled me against him and kissed me a long, defiant, all-encompassing kiss that wasn't about simple romance, but about rewriting the rules of his entire empire, a public declaration that left no room for doubt or second-guessing. He wasn't choosing between his empire and me. He was choosing an empire with me built on a new foundation of respect and shared fire. The kiss was the beginning of a different kind of war, because while Leo had outwardly defied his world and made his choice, the cost of that defiance was immediate and absolute. Damien, who had escaped the Cole betrayal and was now driven completely mad by vengeance, and the sight of Leo risking everything for me, made his final desperate move. I was grabbed in broad daylight, pulled into a van, the sheer terror of the abduction, shutting down my senses and making the world go gray, the smell of fear and cheap vinyl filling my nose, and I woke up tied to a cold metal chair in a dark, empty, cavernous warehouse. This was the fifth and final humiliation, the moment where all the talk of power and defiance came down to a simple, brutal choice: my life for his power. Damien stood in front of me, his face twisted in a manic, terrifying glee, holding a high-powered camera, and he video-called Leo, ensuring that the entire conversation, the ultimate test of Leo's loyalty, was being live-streamed across the underworld's private channels for all the other bosses to witness the ultimate public execution. Choose. Damien snarled into the camera, holding a gun to my temple, the cold steel a shocking weight against my skin, his eyes wide with a triumphant madness. Your empire or this girl, the clock is ticking, Moretti. They're all watching you fail. I could see Leo's face on the small screen, rigid with controlled fury, his composure barely holding, and the knowledge that every boss, every rival, every enemy was watching, analyzing, waiting for him to choose power over love was overwhelming, making the air thick with anticipation. The crushing sense of finality made me weep, the tears streaming down my face, wetting the gag in my mouth, because I knew the history of his world, and I truly believed that he would choose the empire that he had to, that every mafia boss before him had chosen power and survival. I didn't want him to die for me. I wanted him to live and protect Evelyn, fulfilling his promise. So with the last shred of my strength shaking my head violently, I managed to shake the gag loose and looked directly into the camera, past Damien's insane face, past the terrifying metal of the gun, and spoke directly to Leo, my voice hoarse, broken, but clear and resolute. Don't save me. Keep your empire. Save the family, I whispered, giving him the permission to live, the permission to be the powerful, terrifying man his world needed. And with that final surrender, I closed my eyes, accepting my fate as the discarded liability. But the silence I was expecting, the terrible click of the gun, never came, because Leo Moretti had already made his final, irrevocable decision, one that shattered his world completely. He didn't send his army. He stormed Damien's base alone, a single, furious man, trading his life, and his carefully constructed persona for mine, demonstrating that his word and his heart were stronger than his crown. The sound of splintering wood and rapid gunfire ripped through the warehouse, followed by the terrifying sight of Leo, his suit already torn and bloodied from an initial skirmish outside his face, a mask of absolute focused killing determination, bursting through the flimsy door. I lived for my empire, he shouted, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space, the ultimate reversal of his earlier fear, that I would be his weakness. I'm willing to die for her. I choose her. He lunged for me, not for Damien, and just as a shot rang out, he twisted his body, instinctively shielding me completely, the impact of the bullet slamming into his shoulder with a sickening wet thud that was too loud in the silence. The pain that tore through him was visible, a brief spasm of agony and a sharp gasp. But he didn't fall, didn't let go of me. And in that split second of chaos, with Leo's warm, fresh blood staining my jacket, the terror that had paralyzed me instantly evaporated, replaced by the primal instinct of a protector and a fully committed partner. My hands, though still partially tied by the rough rope, were free enough to move, and with a sudden desperate surge of adrenaline and focus, I reached for the gun that had fallen from Damien's hand when Leo tackled him, rolling on the ground nearby. My fingers closed around the cold, heavy metal, the familiar weight a strange comfort, and I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about the consequences or the law. I pulled the trigger myself. The deafening blast ending the violence instantly, the echoes ringing in the metal warehouse. I had killed the man who tried to kill Leo, becoming his true partner, not in power or status, but in blood and sacrifice, in the final necessary act of survival that bound us forever. In the sudden ringing silence of the dark warehouse, with Damien's body still, and Leo breathing heavily, his chest pressed against mine, he slowly unwrapped his arms from around me, his strength wavering now from the blood loss, and then he reached up, gently brushing the tears and soot from my cheek with his uninjured hand. He didn't look at the dead man or the gaping wound on his shoulder. He only looked at me. His eyes dark with a complicated mixture of pain, pride, and finality, and he whispered the words that cemented our future, the words that meant we were finally truly together, forged by fire. You confronted me not knowing who I was. Now, we face the world together. I was never meant to be a mafia queen. I was supposed to be a humble mechanic, quiet, unseen, just trying to keep my sister alive and pay the medical bills. But sometimes when you're cornered and pushed to the absolute edge, the truest part of you comes out, the fire that refuses to be extinguished, the quiet intelligence that solves the most complex problems whether they are in an engine or a criminal enterprise. That quiet strength, the one that everyone overlooked, the quality that Leo had only glimpsed in his mother's eyes, turned out to be the only thing that could save him and remake his entire world. We didn't conquer the city. We conquered the idea that worth is measured by status. We stood firm side by side, and the world had no choice but to adjust to the new truth of what power and loyalty truly look like. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.